Hey, what's up? Nottingham Forest got a 4-point deduction for two very stupid reasons. So let's talk about it. If you follow the stream, then you know that FFP is something I'm not particularly a fan of. I think it's a system that keeps rich clubs rich and poor clubs poor. I'm a big fan of the underdog. I think underdogs are harder to happen in the FFP era. I think you can't like predict your success and spend with it as easily. And I think that if you really wanted to guarantee financial stability of all clubs and like competitive integrity, there are easier ways to do that than FFP. But FFP just allows, it's like a tiered salary cap basically, where like Liverpool can spend 4 times as much as like Nottingham Forest can. And if Nottingham Forest breaks that, then they lose points and get fined. Like it always just felt weird to me. I understand the basic premise, right? It sounds good, but I feel like you lose the forest for the trees when you explain FFP to somebody where you're like, yeah, well, you can only spend what you make on revenue. Like that's, there it is. Except that's not actually the case, and that's kind of actually why Nottingham Forest gets super turbo screwed in this situation. But I realize every time we talk about FFP, I have to address the 12-ton super tanker blue whale on top of an African elephant in the room. That is the Manchester City situation. So let me just clear all this up as somebody that's made multiple videos on the main channel about Everton's situation, about Manchester City's situation. And then the FFP is actually being applied fairly well for the way it's written. Like I know there was a lot of concerns in UEFA and a bunch of countries, including England, that they wouldn't be applying it well. They're applying it pretty well. The Premier League is tracking this stuff. They're reporting it to an independent commission. The independent commission reviews the findings, comes up with an appropriate penalty. Both sides argue their case in front of the independent commission. They come to a final conclusion. That's been happening very consistently, very effectively. But Manchester City is in a situation where you have 115 charges. It's going to take a long time to complete the investigation. And it's also because of how complex those 115 charges are relative to the other point deductions that are being handed out. So you have Everton, where they basically did the most simple thing that you can do to break FFP. They spent a shitload more money than they were supposed to. Like, way more. I'm talking like hundreds of millions of pounds over FFP, which is impressive because they still managed to suck anyways, right? But the main editor of the YouTube channel, name is Reese. Awesome guy. We've been, brothers from other mothers for like 4 years, working on all this YouTube stuff together. He's a huge Everton fan. So, I'm not trying to diss him. But, yeah, it's impressive how much more money they spent over FFP than they were allowed to while still not being good. Most of that on contracts to dudes like, I guess, James Rodriguez. But they also came before the independent commission, and they basically went, yeah, we did spend that. And here's why, and we think we should be exempt from punishment because of the COVID exception and because of all this other stuff. And the independent commission was basically like, those are stupid reasons, and penalize them. But they didn't deny that they spent that amount of money. So it was a pretty open and shut case. You just had to basically decide whether the excuses added up. Like, sorry, Mom, didn't mean to, take the cookies out of the cookie jar, but in my defense, I slipped and then like hit the table and they fell in my mouth. Like that sort of situation. The whodunit was solved. Where with Manchester City, they inflated their income. Okay, so that's what they did, because FFP, you can spend what you make, and then there's like a little leeway over the top, right? But you essentially spend what you make plus $30 million a year. So if you inflate your revenue, you increase the amount of money you can spend. Manchester City inflated its revenue. They, all the different charges are like on this match day, they misreported this revenue, or on, in this particular sponsorship, it wasn't actually the right value. They just fed money through that sponsorship into the club to make it look like, this massive sponsorship was happening when it really shouldn't have been that valuation. That's harder to investigate. That takes a lot of time. Like, I know, unfortunately, for the internet that just thinks that sort of thing can just happen, I realize it's ironic for me to be talking about I am the internet, right? I'm like literally, I live inside of this box. I don't exist anywhere else. If you see me in public, it's an illusion. But the internet, wants it all to be done right away. I would love for it to be done right away, but physically it's not possible. You have to actually go through and investigate each individual instance. Manchester City is going to get its due at one point, but it's going to take some time, and just the fact that the charges haven't come down yet doesn't mean that the FFP situation and the FFP, the application of it, that it's flawed. So leave Manchester City to one side, and let's talk about Nottingham Forest, because these boys are getting screwed, right? I just make a lose the forest for the trees joke in a video about Nottingham Forest, because that was definitely intentional, 100%, and very funny. So Nottingham Forest had two issues that they raised. So Nottingham Forest went over their FFP, same as Everton. They were charged with the same stuff, right? They violated their FFP by financially going over it, right? They didn't do it quite as spectacularly financially as Everton, but they were over, not by a small amount, right? And in order to cover this, they were aware that going into the summer, they were going to need to sell a player. That player, it became apparent, was Brennan Johnson, their academy product. So he was pure profit, if you're speaking from an economic point of view. And they did receive offers up to, as this Guardian article puts it, £42.9 million. But they felt that they could get more money for him. And so they waited to the end of the transfer window, and they did get more money for him. They got £47.5 million from Tottenham for Brennan Johnson. So great, right? That helps with FFP. Except no, it doesn't. You're shit out of luck, because the FFP deadline was June 30th, even though the transfer window goes to the beginning of September. So make that make sense. But if you want to comply with FFP, you have, even if you're haggling, even if you got a better deal, which clubs aren't always able to do in that situation. The reason deadline day is so freaking exciting is because people use the whole transfer window to do these negotiations. Because that's how this stuff works, right? Like, you use the transfer window to do these negotiations, shop them out to everywhere else. But if you're one of these clubs that's up against the line, all of a sudden you need to think about, selling these players before June 30th. Or else you're not going to satisfy the FFP over the 3-year period, because it's just going to reset. And what makes it even more annoying for Nottingham Forest that they were having to do this in the first place is the second reason they're getting screwed. They kind of feed into each other. I feel like they typically do in this situation. And that's that FFP is not the same, right? If you didn't know that, then allow me to be your, welcome to your masterclass. I'm Jose Mourinho. FFP is not the same even in England, depending on what level you're at. So EFL has their FFP and Premier League has its FFP. And the amount of loss you can take over a 3-year period, because all of FFP is applied over a 3-year period, it's different by a lot, right? So if you're in the EFL, let me see if I can find these numbers. You can lose £61 million over a 3-year period. You might see this number above lurking. Yeah, that's right. If you're in the Premier League, you can lose £105 million. This is the difference that can exist between your revenue and your spending over a 3-year period. That's a pretty serious difference. So if you're thinking, when a club gets promoted from the Championship to the Premier League, that means we get to look back at their last 3 years and apply this. You'd be wrong. You get to apply 1 year of Premier League FFP and 2 years of EFL FFP. Why? Because fuck them. That's why. So not only are you getting promoted, which means your revenue is inherently lower than the clubs that you're competing against. That's what makes promotion challenging, right? You've got Crystal Palace, who's basically the wallpaper of the Premier League at this point. They've been collecting those fat Premier League TV checks for 15 years, right? You've got all the big teams, all these teams that have stupid revenue because the Premier League's just, covered in money, just lathered in gold. And you're jumping into that. Nottingham Forest is also not one of those teams that was getting parachute payments before it was promoted. We're not talking about Norwich City, right? Some team that just, they collect parachute payments like Pokemon, right? This is not Nottingham Forest. They get promoted. They have they've got championship revenue streams, right? And they've got championship spending caps, right? So not only do you have your championship revenue streams, so based off of FFP, because you've got your 2 championship years holding you down in terms of how much money you've made anyways, you aren't going to be able to spend as much. Well, now the amount past your revenue you can spend is literally lower than every other team in the Premier League except the other 2 you just got promoted with. Unless, of course, it's like a Norwich City, where you could have something that looks like a V, where you've got a Premier League year, a championship year, and a Premier League year, right? So it's just the teams that were in the championship the last 2 years that have this lower cap on how much they can spend over their revenue, and then they have the one Premier League year. So Nottingham Forest points this out. They go to the Premier League, and they said they were very disappointed, like in their quotes, about the Premier League was really trying to go after them for this. And I think they're right. I think that's stupid. I think that makes no sense. I mean, it's already hard enough to get promoted to the Premier League, but now you have to deal with the fact that your revenue cap is lower. Your revenue is already so much lower, dude. But if you're in the Premier League, especially with the future income of parachute payments, your club is not in danger of going bankrupt, right? It's not. Because even if you drop 0 points in the Premier League the next season, you are going to get a bag chilling in the championship for the next 3 years or whatever it is that you're getting parachute payments. So how can that not at least knock up your FFP to where you can, at least spend the same amount over your revenue over the last 3-year period? Like, I realize that would require, I don't know, some sort of collaboration or some sort of accounting gymnastics. Like, because if you go back down to the championship, you'd probably need a bit of a leeway, right, in terms of how much you were spending. Or maybe you just need to sell a player if you go back down to the championship. But I have a hard time believing you're going to blow this out of the water with the parachute payments you'd be getting from the Premier League in the first place. You'd be able to stay under that. But the way the system is set up now, I mean, you're just double screwing teams that got promoted. And not to mention, you're double screwing teams that got promoted. But the freaking calendar resets on the 30th of June, right? The majority of the transfer window is after that. Why does the calendar reset in the middle of the transfer window? Why does it matter if they sell Brennan Johnson on the 29th of June or the 1st of September, right? The transfer window is universal, at least in the professional divisions of England, where we're talking about specifically English FFP here. Why not start it on the 1st? I realize that would require a little tomfoolery, right, in terms of, we've got some ticket revenue that's coming from these August matches. You'd have to just incorporate that as well. But who cares? It's still a year. It's still 365 days, and it makes a hell of a lot more sense and allows clubs to handle all of their transfer business without trying to fit it into some artificial deadline you've created. Not to mention, this club's already been screwed twice, by the fact that they're getting less money, right? And the cap on how much they can spend over their revenue is way lower by like $30 million. And I mean, Forrest points this out. They said, we were also surprised the Premier League gave no consideration to the unique circumstances of the club and its mitigation. It would make it, they went on to say, it would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for newly promoted clubs without parachute payments, which they didn't have, obviously, to compete, thus undermining the integrity and competitiveness of the Premier League. Yeah. Duh. Have you noticed it's a little harder for teams that are getting promoted recently? I thought the whole point of the Premier League was that, wow, it's like the most balanced league in the world. Not for the teams at the bottom. They're getting housed all the time, probably because they have all these stupid rules holding them back. Nottingham Forest is one of the clubs that really went for it. They signed like 86 players, and then they ended up, all they needed to do, this transfer, by the way, the Brennan Johnson transfer would literally cover it. They wouldn't have gotten the point deduction. So if it ended on September 1st, they would have been good. Far as I understand everything that happened here. So the fact that they called that a near miss, they brought it to the Premier League and said, hey, we tried. We got more money for them on September 1st or whatever. And the Premier League was like, yeah, never mind. Premier League was asking for an 8-point suspension. The independent commission only gave them 4. I mean, I know we're all new to this whole FFP thing, but I think that Nottingham Forest, via getting a 4-point deduction, has identified some pretty obvious flaws in the system here that it would behoove everybody involved to try and fix. At least to give, newly promoted teams a fair shake and to just have the freaking transfer windows make sense so teams aren't doing the math about, do I want to take like a 4-point deduction? Or, is that worth it based off the profit I think I'm going to get by September 1st? Or should we just sell the guy now and not get the 4-point deduction? Like, how much more money could we make if we waited September 1st? Or I got to buy this guy before June 30th. or else it's going to hurt our FFP, right? But we've got a little room in our FFP before June 30th, so let's buy this guy now. Like, all of those calculations are stupid. I'd prefer to live in a world where they didn't need to happen. I don't know the difficult logistical challenge it would take to reset the calendar to early September. But, I mean, if you don't do it at some point, you just live in like stupidity forever. So I hope they change it at some point. I feel bad for Nottingham Forest and their fans. And they're going to get to Manchester City eventually. This stuff is just a lot easier. Apparently bullying newly promoted teams is easier. But no, these reasons were stupid. I'll see you guys.